Okay, so good day, everyone. It is a pleasure to have this conversation with everyone who's gathered to listen to us today. My name is Jackie Patterson. I am the Senior Director of the Environmental and Climate Justice Program of the NAACP, and I'm super honored to be joined by Vanessa Nakate, who is a climate activist from Uganda, and Isha Clarke, who is a co-founder and activist with Youth versus Apocalypse. And so I wanted to just get started with a few brief remarks, just framing our conversation today. First off, with the NAACP's work on environmental and climate justice, I'm the founding director of the program. And when I first started doing the work with the NAACP, which stands for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, it's a 111-year-old civil rights organization. But when I first started, people were surprised that a civil rights organization was doing work on environment, including the communities that we served, even. And so the rationale that I always gave was that, and continue to give in some ways, because people continue to ask that question, even though the program has been in existence for 11 years now. And the answer we provide is that the constituency we serve is who are basically often African American communities, low income communities, other marginalized communities, as well as just communities in general. But our communities tend to be disproportionately impacted by the entire climate continuum, from the fact that we have communities that are more likely to live next to coal-fired power plants and oil and gas facilities and incinerators. And so that means that we have the health conditions that come from that, whether it's our African American children are 3 to 5 times more likely to enter the hospital because of an asthma attack, and 2 to 3 times more likely to die from an asthma attack. And African American families are 71% of African American families live in counties in violation of federal air pollution standards. An African American family making $50,000 a year is more likely to live next to a toxic facility than a white American family making $15,000 a year. So often people assume that the ways that we're more harmed come through income, but even race above income. It's not just poor communities that are disproportionately impacted by the polluting facilities that drive climate change. It's also other communities, and race is the factor that's the commonality there. And so whether it's that side of the continuum in terms of the drivers of climate change, or it's the impacts of climate change, from the fact that that disasters are hitting us all, but then when they hit our communities, they hit them harder because of the pre-existing vulnerabilities, whether it's poor housing stock or a lack of insurance, or it's infrastructure issues, because so often our communities don't have the levee infrastructure or the stormwater management infrastructure that other communities enjoy. So when disasters come, they hit us harder and they harm us more. When we talk about shifts in agricultural yields, we already have a situation where we have what they call what was traditionally or historically segregation, but is even in these days it continues to be segregation. Before it was institutionalized by certain policies and practices historically that still continue on to this day to some extent. And so that means we're separated from key resources such as food resources, whether it's a grocery store or a farmer's market. And so we're more likely to be impacted by the shifts in agricultural yields that make healthy and nutritious foods more available. When we talk about sea level rise, our communities are often are now under threat of being displaced by sea level rise, but the resources for either helping to buttress the community against the impacts of sea level rise, whether it's making sure that a seawall is in place, or again, better stormwater management systems, or even helping to preserve the wetlands in each and every one of our coastal communities. We're finding ways that we're not as protected as other communities. And so we are finding ourselves at risk in terms of the impacts of sea level rise. And so all of these make often there's this term now of that communities of color and low income communities in the United States are considered to be what they call the South within the North, which is really out of acknowledgement of the global dynamics of climate change and the ways that that nations in the global South are impacted. Which is why I'm so glad to be having this conversation with my co-panelists and really talking about the commonalities across nations and across oceans. They say that when the U.S. sneezes, the world catches a cold, and in the United States, we and has come up with the whole conversations around the racial reckoning as well as the COVID-19 impacts. They say when America gets a cold, Black America gets pneumonia. So we know that the United States is 4% of the global population, but 25% of the emissions that drive climate change. We also know that 25% of the global incarcerated population is in the United States. That 25% of the COVID-19 cases are in the United States, even though again we are 4% of the global population, which speaks to the broken systems that we're in and what it means in terms of impacts. So even though we are driving climate change across the country, across the world more than other nations, then we still have these punitive immigration systems, whether it's even though folks are coming across the border often due to climate forced migration. I've been working on places like Laredo where I hear story after story of bread baskets drying up and people just coming to survive and feed their families. And there's room for us to offer sanctuary instead of locking kids in cages. But instead, we don't have the political system that really opens our arms to folks to welcome them, both just from a humanitarian standpoint and because we are actually responsible for their homes not being inhabitable. So yet we find hope. We have found hope in the rising generation. And that's why I'm, again, so blessed to be here with Vanessa Nakate and Isha Clarke, because their leadership as women, as Black women, is what's inspiring and what we know that we need in order to make the transformational systems changes that we need to both push back on climate change and make sure that we're actually advancing climate justice. They have in common their ancestry, their activism, and their attitude, their can-do attitude, which is saying that we can make these changes that are necessary. We know that in Uganda, where Vanessa hails from, they're experiencing unusually high temperatures as well as increased floods and landslides, and she's raising the voice on that and calling these issues to consciousness. We know in Oakland that right now Oakland is suffused with a cloud of smoke because of the proliferation of forest fires out west, that we see every year. We know that last month temperatures soared to 98 degrees in Oakland, breaking last year's record temperature of 90 degrees. And we see that across the country where year after year we're breaking each previous year's record. And so as they're rising and really visibilizing, we know Vanessa will tell us about what invisibilization looks like from front hand and in literal terms from her experience that I think is now famous across the world. But and we look forward to hearing of the connections that Isha and Vanessa make in the work that they do at the local level, at the state level, and at the nation level, and globally. So I want to just do a brief introduction of both of our panelists. So Vanessa Nakate is a climate activist from Uganda. She was the first Fridays for Future climate activists in Uganda and founder of the Rise Up climate movement in order to amplify the voices of activists from Africa. Her work includes raising awareness to the danger of climate change, the causes and the impacts. And she spearheaded the campaign Save Congo Rainforest, which is facing massive deforestation. This campaign later spread to other countries from Africa to Europe, and she's working on a project that involves installation of solar and institutional stoves in schools, which I'm super excited about hearing more about. My first experience with a solar installation was in Tanzania. I spent a lot of time in Tanzania and other countries in sub-Saharan Africa doing work on environmental issues, as well as gender justice, as well as HIV and AIDS and violence against women issues. And particularly particularly was when I visited the solar array that was in Muheza Hospital in rural Tanzania. It was my first experience of seeing how a solar array can power an entire hospital in a deep rural area, and that was 15 years ago or so. And so they were way ahead of the times that when we're in the United States, we're finally kind of catching up with what the necessary change that we need to make to clean energy. So definitely looking forward to hearing more from Vanessa. Isha Clarke is a co-founder and activist, co-founder of Youth versus Apocalypse, and a recent high school graduate, born, raised, and educated in Oakland, California. Isha recognizes that climate change is a consequence of fundamental systems of oppression like white supremacy, racism, and colonialism. Because of this, people of color, indigenous communities, and working class people are disproportionately burdened by the impacts of the climate catastrophe. Knowing this, Isha's work is focused on building a movement that follows the leadership of frontline communities, creates solidarity between other fights for justice, and works to dismantle the systems of oppression that fuel climate change. As a result of this work, Isha was awarded the 2019 Brower Youth Award, 2020 Diller Tikam Alum Award, and has become a nationally recognized speaker, presenter, and writer. So, without further ado, I would love to have both Vanessa and Isha just kind of introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about the work you do and what brought you into this activism that you're doing. Starting with Vanessa. Thank you.
Well, hi, I'm Vanessa Nakate, and I am a climate activist from Uganda. I started doing activism in the first week of January 2019, and I became an activist simply because I had seen how much the climate crisis was the biggest threat facing humanity right now. In the year 2018, I felt like I wanted to do something that would bring change in the lives of the people in my community. So I decided to carry out research to understand the challenges that they faced, and finding that climate change was one of those challenges was a surprise to me, because in schools it's more of the theoretical teaching of the climate crisis. It's not the reality of it. They don't tell us that it's real, they don't tell us that it's happening. So I decided to read more about it, to get to understand the causes, to get to understand the impacts. And when I had seen that some of these things were actually visible in my country, from the north to the east to the west, I decided that I had to become a voice in the climate movement and demand for climate action from the leaders.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate you. And Isha.
Hey, my name's Isha. I'm also a climate activist, and it's an honor to share the stage with both of y'all. Um, I started in this movement when I was a freshman in high school, so that was 2017. And, I'd always been really aware of social justice and the realities of America and the world, just because of my family. But I never felt connected to anything that was environmental or climate related, because it was always presented to me as something that was very white and of privilege. And I didn't feel connected to that at all. But when I was a freshman in high school, I was invited to an action targeting Phil Tagami, who is a very prominent developer in Oakland and who was and still is trying to build a coal terminal through West Oakland, which is where I live and is a community that is predominantly working class people of color. And it was at this action where I recognized what environmental racism is. And you were talking so amazingly about it earlier, but I realized how wrong that narrative that I was told was and how actually destructive it is, because it takes away from what's actually happening, which is Black and brown, indigenous, working class people getting years taken off of their lives because of racist pollution and poisoning. And so I felt like I wanted to do something, and I felt like the people who are actually being impacted by these things needed to be the loudest and needed to be the leaders. And so Um, Now we're here with Youth versus Apocalypse. Yeah, so I started off in environmental justice and worked my way to climate, which are one and the same thing.
Thank you very much. Yes. Awesome. So I wanted to hear a little bit more about how each of you sees the importance of youth leadership in particular in the climate justice realm, and just how your perspective as youth and how you've been received as a youth leader, and as well as what you see as the way forward in terms of youth leadership. So we'll start again with Vanessa, and then
Well, first of all, I have to acknowledge that youth leadership is needed and it is very important because the youth are not afraid to speak the truth to power. They're not afraid to state the facts the way they are, the science the way it is. They are not afraid to just speak out what is really happening because we have so much seen the climate issues being sugar coated, and we've been made to feel like this isn't a crisis, this isn't a challenge, and then the youth leadership comes in and says no, this is an emergency, this is a crisis, this is a disaster, and you must treat it as a crisis. So I think youth leadership is really important because they speak truth to power, and it is the future of the youth that is at stake. That means their voices matter at such a point. They have a right to demand for what rightfully belongs to them. You know,
Mhm.
first of all, it's already disturbing that the youth have to fight for something that has to be given to them. Children don't
Mhm.
have to be on the streets, children have to be in school, they have to be out
Mhm.
playing games, or they have to be at home playing indoor games. Whatever children are supposed to do, that is what they are expected to do. Maybe those who are not
Mhm.
children but they're youth, probably they have to be in school and studying, but then they have to go on the streets, they have to demand for action because our adults have always been very disappointing, and it's really sad. So I think youth leadership is important because they state the facts the way they are. They don't sugarcoat the disasters that we are seeing, the wildfires, the hurricanes, the racist pollution that Isha has talked about. They clearly state these points that we don't have justice at all. There is no social justice, there is no environmental justice, there is no climate justice. And I think the future of youth leadership is, of course, um, one that will lead to change. I believe that the youth are able to transform this world through their leadership.
thank you.
Mhm.
And Isha.
Wow. Well, I don't really know if there's anything to add to that. I feel like Vanessa perfectly summed that up. This is our future, and the adults are the ones that brought us here. Um, so I think it's important to have the people who are most impacted and are going to be most impacted leading the fight. And so for me, that means not only young people, but that means frontline young people. That means we need to have indigenous people leading, Black folks, other people of color. We need queer folks and trans folks and differently able folks and everyone who's been marginalized and silenced in the world to be our leaders. Because the truth of the matter is that this climate crisis is a result of these systems of oppression that we are so attuned to experiencing. And so we need the people who are at the forefront of that to tell us how we need to rip it out and what needs to be put in its place.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And yes, that's well stated because we really do need to not just kind of tweak the deeply flawed systems, but actually, as you say, rip it out.
Mm.
And I think that's the best way. So, so both of you are. Uh, Maybe I shouldn't assume I put my she her there, but do you both identify as she her or yes? And Vanessa.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So both of you are female, and I one of the things that when I was doing work in South Africa in particular, I was struck by South Africa and Zimbabwe. They talked about how with the shifts in water water access, that girls are having to walk further to get water, as a result of climate change. And so whereas girls had to walk maybe a couple of kilometers to get water, or what they're now having to walk 5 kilometers to get water. And really, one in terms of so both in terms of like that, meaning that people aren't able to go to school in some cases because they're having to walk further, but also in a very grim focus group, they talked about wanting to actually have female controlled condoms because the likelihood of sexual assault was so extensive in that further walk to get water, and they wanted the girls to be able to wear female controlled condoms every time they went to make that walk. And so that was just one of the most devastating things I've ever heard in my life. And so these kind of gendered impacts that we're seeing, and also in the US context, we are also seeing gendered impacts, whether it's the pollution that is tied to endocrine disruptors, or the violence against women that happens in the context of the oil and gas pipelines, particularly against Indigenous women. It's tied to missing and murdered Indigenous women. And then we also, well, there's, yes, all too many examples. So just wondering if each of you could touch on the gendered, the intersection between gender justice and climate justice as you experience it. And as I said, even though we talk about those negative impacts, I'm just seeing with you and others the awesomeness of women's leadership, and the kind of unique recognition that I'm finding that women have around these comprehensive, vast systems changes, not just tweaking a system, recognizing the deep systemic changes that need to be made. So just wondering if both of you could kind of comment on those intersections. Again, start with Vanessa.
Yes, first of all, there is no climate justice and environmental justice without gender justice. Because I come from communities whereby it is the women that put food on the table, it is the women that put water on the table for their household, like you've talked about. And you find that in times when they experience a climate disaster, many of them have to do much more work to recover everything that has been lost. Many of them have to walk very long distances in order to get water for their families. And many of them are, it's not only about the violence that they face on the way to get that water from maybe the wells or from the streams, but then if they're not able to get that water, their husbands, they tend not to be really nice to them because they think that they are lazy and they're not really doing anything and they're not doing what they're supposed to do. So many of them, they may experience that the gender abuse on the way to get the water. But if they don't get it, more violence awaits them at home. So there is so much of a linkage between the climate justice and then gender equality. You find that when a family loses everything, and some of the schools have to drop out of school, some of the children have to drop out of school, the girl child is always the first on the list to drop out of school. Why? Because the parents expect bride price from their husband to be, and then they're also reducing on the number of children in their homes. And then the other issue that I would talk about, I come from a country whereby I grew up when they tell us that girls are not supposed to climb trees, basically as a cultural norm. But you find that in the case of an occurrence of a flood, most people who survive a flood, they find them on trees because they climb them. But if a flood happens and I don't know how to climb a tree, I don't know how to swim, there is no other way for me to survive. So I believe that in every disaster, women are affected the most. When you look at single mothers, when they experience these disasters like hurricanes and they are pushed to the streets, they are faced with so much of gender based violence. So there is no way we can have gender equality without addressing the issues in the climate movement. The gender issues and the climate issues, they are so interconnected. We cannot achieve one without the other. And then also, you find that in the spaces of people who talk about climate change in the discussions, women leadership is still lacking in that. If women are affected the most, then they should be the leaders in these discussions. And it's not about them being invited to the table. They also have to wear the same. Their discussions have to wear the same. Because many times they show us that the women have been invited on the table, but the weight of their discussions is actually lower than the weight of other people's discussions. So I feel like there is so much to do with gender inequalities and the climate injustices. We cannot have gender equality without climate justice, and we cannot have climate justice mainly without gender equality.
Thank you.
Mm.
Thank you so much. Yes. Isha.
Gosh, I'm like, what do I add? She keeps saying everything.
Mhm.
Um, so I'll just say that I 100% agree with everything that Vanessa said. Thank you so much for that. And what I would add, I think specifically in the US, I would like to talk about the burden of Black women as it relates to really everything, because what we're seeing right now are all of these crises unfolding in the US because of these unsustainable systems that we're built on top of, systems of white supremacy and colonialism and capitalism. And the burdens of dealing with those crises and of holding the movements and the people affected by them are Black women,
Mm.
and are women of color too, but largely Black women. And I think that, you know, to bring it to talking about the recent police violence, where's the justice for Breonna Taylor? Black women are holding us in all of these spaces and are holding together our society when we're experiencing this economic downturn and the spread of this pandemic that should not have been going on this long, when we're experiencing increasing environmental racism and impacts of climate change. We're seeing Black women hold up our society, and in turn, where's our justice? That's just something I would like to offer to that. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So we have about 2.5 minutes left, and I want to make sure that you both are able to answer the question, as we go forward, what gives you hope? What type of solutions do we need to advance in order to really address the issue, and really in a multi-solving capacity, given, as we say, the root causes that we've all talked about? So I'll start with Isha and then go to Vanessa.
Cool. I think right now, what we need to fight for, what we need to talk about, and what we need to acknowledge is the need for collective liberation. And the reason why I say that is because, again, I'll say it a million times, the reason why we're here is because, especially America, but the entire world is built on top of these systems of white supremacy and colonialism and economic exploitation. And that's why we're here. And that is also what is causing all other marginalized communities to suffer. And so we have to recognize that climate justice, that the work of all people right now needs to be dismantling these systems that are at fault for these crises in every way that they exist, whether that be through environmental racism and climate change, or through faulty education systems, or through gender-based violence, or through, police violence, whatever that may be. That is climate justice. And, we're existing in a very scary time, but I believe that there is true opportunity here, that there's an opportunity that has never been seen before to do the work that our ancestors have been trying to do for centuries, because all of the crises that we're seeing are these very visceral experiences of watching these unsustainable systems fail. And because of that, that means that we have this opportunity to actually dismantle them because they're already not working and we're going to need new systems. So this is our opportunity to implement truly just and sustainable systems that are envisioned by the people who have been most impacted by this faulty system. And so that's what's giving me hope right now. And that's what I'm fighting to do for collective liberation.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Yes, collective liberation indeed. Vanessa, you get the last minute. Um,
Well, basically, just to add on what Isha said, so after us dismantling all the systems, I believe that we need a system that is inclusive, equitable, and sustainable. Thank you.
Mm.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. Well, this was amazing. I deeply appreciated this conversation. It was definitely too short, but we hope that those who are listening will have gained for it and really will follow both Vanessa and Isha going forward in their awesome work and continue to be inspired and led by it. So thank you all. Take good care.
Thank you.
Hello again, everyone. I'm Jonathan Visbal, Chairman of the Board of World Affairs, and I just want to thank all of our speakers for a fantastic day at the Global Philanthropy Forum. The energy that young people like Vanessa Nakate and Isha Clarke are dedicating to bring climate change to the top of the global agenda is inspiring. Thanks to them both and to Jacqueline Patterson of the NAACP for her great work. This brings day 2 of the GPF to a close on an inspiring note, and tomorrow we'll set our sights on the way forward and consider more reasons for optimism. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. Pacific time.